let's go over some terminology that we use to help guide students through class and to help orient them in space. So here I have my mat under my hammock, and if I'm going to start the class, whether it be watching video and my video screen is right here, or whether it be a live class situation and maybe the teacher is somewhere, a few feet away from me there, then this is considered the top of my mat, and that would be the bottom of my mat. Or sometimes we say the front of the mat and the back of the mat. And that probably makes some amount of sense to you, right? And the hammock, of course, is now at this place behind me. And of course, here it is in front of me, right? That might seem clear at this moment, but let's take a look at an example where it might feel like it gets switched around in your head and where it would be helpful to understand that this orientation and the words we're using for the mat never changes. This is always going to be the front of the mat. That will always be the back of the mat. So for example, chair pose. My feet are at the front of the mat. I'm facing the front of the mat. Now I go into a side plank. So I've turned sideways to my mat. Now my mind and my eyes might think, oh, this is the front of my mat or the top of my mat because that's where my head is and that's where I can see. Yeah, but it's not. This is still going to be the back of my mat, and that's still the front of my mat. And that doesn't change when I do something where, like for example, Warrior Two. And if I've turned myself around, and sometimes I do this in classes, as the teacher, I'm turning the students around. This will still be the back of my mat. It hasn't changed, as long as it's within the same class, right? Warrior Two, my right foot is now at the back of my mat. I'm looking to my right fingertips and I'm facing the back of my mat. And it's partly because I'm facing away from what I'm watching, either the teacher, live teacher, or the screen, right? So that's the back. Now, it's also partly because of what happens with your hammock. If when you get into your hammock, right, we start moving around and doing some twists and facing the back of the mat, the hammock is twisted. So we always want to, at some point, come back to facing the front so that we unwind the hammock. So that is why we never really change our terminology for the mat and the orientation in space. Now, it gets a little trickier even when we're talking about what we're doing with our body with relationship to the hammock, because sometimes the terminology that I use personally as a teacher does change, because when you go upside down, people can get very disoriented. And so it's almost easier just to go with what the student is actually seeing with their eyes and how their body relates to that. So, for example, when I go upside down, even though that's the back of my mat, and over there is the front of my mat, when I look up, my legs look like they're behind the hammock, right? So that can help me understand. If I take the legs behind the hammock, and let's say I want to give an instruction of putting your feet on top of the hammock. So bend the knees, wrap the feet around the hammock, and place the ankles over the hammock on the front side of the hammock, right? So I rarely say those exact words, but it would be helpful for you to know, right, if I'm helping you to come back up to sit, to slide your hands behind the hammock to be able to pull yourself up back to standing, right? So now that's a very simple example, but I hope it helps you get a better understanding of maybe some of the words that might get used and how they get used and applied in a class. Some other terminology that we use in our aerial yoga classes is inside the hammock and outside of the hammock. Now, if we were always using the hammock in a way where it's spread out, then there would be no confusion at all. Like, it's very easy to understand that right now my body's inside the hammock, and here my hands are outside and my feet are outside, yeah? But the thing is that sometimes, many times, we are using the hammock where it's completely gathered. And in fact, I will even sort of twist it up a little so that makes it even easier for you to see. So it's gathered. And this is considered the inside of the hammock now, and this is considered the outside of the hammock, especially on the sides, not so much under here, but the outside and the inside. Yeah. That might even seem clear now, but once you start maneuvering around, and especially if you go upside down, sometimes that can get a little confusing, and I'll show you an example. So I'm going to do basic hip hang. So right now, as I hang upside down, my body is inside the hammock. It's in between the two sides, even though it may not feel like it's inside, right? And one of the common variations we'll do is we'll ask you to wrap an ankle or a foot around the hammock. And the instruction would be to take the foot around the outside of the hammock first, and then wrap it. So that means I want to take the leg around, and I'll show you from the side here. I want to take it around there, and now I can wrap my toes. Not the other way around. If I just took my foot back and hook the toes over, it may, from your mind's perspective, feel like, oh, that's the same thing. But it's not really. I've got the foot on the inside of the hammock and then hooked. The other way, outside and then hook, is the correct way. And the thing is most often if you make a mistake, it's not such a tragedy. But sometimes it's crucial for keeping you connected to the hammock and not having the fabric slip from its way that it's holding you in space. Yeah, so it is quite important to understand.